Looks like we have quite a few people in, so I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, welcome. For those who have not been here before, welcome. We are the Marine Environmental Education Center located on Hollywood Beach, Florida, and we are currently closed. We've been getting asked a lot if we have an opening date. We don't have one just yet. We are still trying to plan on how to open safely because we are a pretty small facility. It is just not possible for us to socially distance. So we are still making plans, but we'll be sure to notify everyone when we do have an opening date. Since we cannot open right now, we still wanted to go ahead with our mission and our goal to educate the public about our awesome Florida ecosystems, about marine science, environmental science, and conservation. So we reached out to all of our scientific friends and asked them if they'd be willing to present about their specialties for the MEEC. We are offering this free webinar series every Saturday from 1 to 2 p.m. And today you guys actually get to work with me. So I am Taylor Apter. I am one of the educators at the Marine Environmental Education Center. And since we've been closed, we've been taking the opportunity to expand our virtual repertoire, all of the things that we could be teaching people virtually, but also for when we open back up, we'll have a bunch of really cool new education programs. So today we are going to be talking about ocean acidification. It is a vital issue that I feel like people just don't talk about enough. It's super intimidating sounding, but we're going to break it down as well as we can today. Just so you all know, I have everyone's mics off and everyone's videos are off, so I can't see or hear you, but I do have the chat open. I'll have it open the whole time. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, technical issues, anything like that, please go ahead, throw it in the chat and I'll be sure to answer it. I think that is about it. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. If you guys have any issues, I'm not 100% sure you are seeing the correct screen, but I think you are. Please throw it into the chat and I will let you know if it is good. Okay, cool. So welcome, welcome. Ocean acidification is a super important issue that we just don't talk about quite a lot. It is kind of intimidating, very chemistry heavy. But as you could see, having an acidic ocean is a problem, especially for all of our calcareous shell building ecosystem building organisms. So I actually have a video right at the beginning that sort of breaks it down for us, what ocean acidification is, why it's important. And it's a very short video, only a minute, but then we will go in depth to everything that they mention and sort of break it down even smaller into more bite-sized pieces. So I think that I set it up so you could hear it. There's just music in the background, so audio is not super important, but let me know if you guys have any. So that was a lot of information all at once, but it really is a very comprehensive video that sort of breaks down what is ocean acidification, how does it happen, and why is it an issue. So we're just going to put the points made and try and make it a little bit more, make it a little bit easier for us to understand. So what causes ocean acidification? It refers to the reduction of pH in the ocean over an extended period of time. So we'll talk a little bit more about pH, what that means, and why having a lower pH is not necessarily good for the ocean a little bit later down the road. But it's mainly caused by the atmosphere. dissolving into the ocean. So ocean acidification is something that just happens naturally because there's always going to be carbon in the air. There's always going to be carbon going into our oceans. That carbon dioxide is meant to be absorbed by our oceans. And it's occurred naturally, but over a very long period of time. Whereas right now, in the last like 20 million years, it's becoming a faster and faster process where more carbon is being put into the oceans in a shorter period of time. And the processes that usually regulate that just aren't keeping up. They can't keep up and make it so it's healthy for the organisms living in that ecosystem. And that's why it's a big deal. It's not that it's happening that's a big deal. It's the rate in which it's happening is the big deal. So first, I want to address why is CO2 increasing? Because like we said, ocean acidification caused by lots of CO2 going into our oceans, but why is it increasing so much right now compared to the timeline of the ocean that we talked about before? So CO2 is stored in coal, natural gases, oils, fossil fuels, basically all of our energy producing substances that we as humans use. When you burn these things, it actually releases the CO2 stored in them into the atmosphere. And those global processes that usually regulate it by taking it up by respiration with the trees usually take up CO2 when they do photosynthesis, right? And it getting absorbed into the ocean and getting stored that way, or getting turned back into coal or natural gases and getting stored in those types of ways takes a really long time. It takes way, way, way too many years to be doing it as quickly as we're releasing the CO2, because I drove my car here. I use heating and air conditioning in my apartment. Like I'm using energy all day in so many different little ways. And since all that energy is coming from us burning things that are releasing CO2, it's just constantly, all of us are putting out lots and lots of CO2, and the earth is just not equipped to quickly put it back into its place. So another one that I did want to touch on is deforestation. So like I said, as you see in this cool little graph over here, the uptake is going to be those green arrows. So it goes into the ocean, it goes into trees and plants through photosynthesis. That CO2 gets taken up and stored places, so it's not just floating around in our atmosphere, but because of deforestation, we have less trees to pick up all that CO2. And because the ocean is picking up so much CO2 to try and make up for it, it is becoming more acidic, and that is the issue that we're seeing right now. So how does it get into our oceans? Like I said, we're releasing it into the atmosphere, it's floating around, doing its thing out there, but how does it actually get into our ocean waters? So ocean absorbs about 1/4 to 30% of the CO2 that we create when we burn fossil fuels. It's really caused by two main factors. First is going to be the differences in pressure between air and the ocean, causing an exchange. So basically, so much CO2 living in our atmosphere is sort of pushing down on the ocean. And when it pushes down on it, it actually gets absorbed into the water and pushed down deeper and deeper into our oceans. Just like in this beautiful little GIF here, you could see all of that getting diffused down into our oceans. But also things like marine plants and phytoplankton absorb carbon dioxide just like our trees do. When they are doing photosynthesis, when they're getting energy from the sun, they're picking up CO2, using that as like part of the process to make themselves food, make it their energy source, which is great. But when they take up all of that CO2 and then they die as well, they sink down to the bottom of the ocean, and they actually are full of CO2 storage that gets left in the ocean. So those are the two main ways that CO2 enters the ocean, by diffusion or by photosynthesis through all of those plants. And I will show you what one of the causes of that is actually going to be. I'm sure that we have all heard about our increasing ocean temperatures lately. It is a hot button topic, so I just wanted to touch on it real quick. But today we are focusing on that ocean acidification. But as that CO2 is absorbed into our ocean, it is actually also increasing the temperature. So I'm sure that we all have heard a little bit about how the climate is heating in some places, but the ocean absorbs the CO2. It also absorbs that heat. It is sort of our safety blanket. It absorbs all of this junk that we put out into the atmosphere that we don't really want there. The ocean sort of absorbs it as our safety blanket, tries to get it out of our atmosphere. that includes our CO2 and our heat. So you can see it's a good example of things being absorbed into the ocean is this temperature graph, because temperature is something that's really easy for us to study, to take. And you could see, I think this is from 2011 to today, how much difference there is in the amount of heat in those oceans. So correlating that to the CO2 is what we're going to kind of do today. So increasing CO2 in relation to pH. So we've talked about how we are increasing our carbon dioxide emissions by burning all those fossil fuels, and the ocean is just trying to take it all up, get it out of our atmosphere as much as it can. But how does that actually relate to ocean acidification? How does that relate to our pH? So if you look at this really cool graph over here, the 1960s is when they started saying, maybe we should be measuring these things. Maybe carbon emissions are a problem and we should start taking a regular level of them just so we could write down and know how much is out there. So this graph started in the 1960s, and you could see that it is increasing all the way to 2010. So carbon dioxide levels have been slowly increasing in the atmosphere and in our oceans since the 1960s, but probably even before then, we just weren't really taking the levels. We weren't trying to quantify that. But as you see here, as that carbon level increases, in the 1990s, they were like, hey, maybe we should also be checking the pH of the ocean. So you could see when they started taking that, it showed that there was actually a correlation where as carbon increased, the pH decreased. It was a direct correlation. They could say, oh, there's probably some sort of relationship there. You could also see how it's kind of like a spiky. It goes up, down, up, down, up, down, all these different points. And that's because there are seasonal variations. So in the summer, when we have lots of heat, lots of photosynthesis, lots of plants thriving in the summer, there are going to be more plants, which means that they are using more of that carbon dioxide. They're doing more photosynthesis, and that just means that there is a drop in the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere and our oceans. So in the summer, you'll see a little drop. And then when it's winter and all of those plants that use the carbon dioxide for photosynthesis die off, then there's nothing to take up that extra carbon, and there's a little spike. And it's just a seasonal cycle that goes up, down, up, down, up, down every year. So the trending line is what we care about, and it is trending upwards. So you can see even in the pH, since we said that carbon dioxide and pH are really closely linked, you can see that there are seasonal variations in each of them, but the general trend is that carbon dioxide is on the rise and pH is slowly decreasing. So what exactly is pH? We've thrown that out there a lot today, but I feel like it's not something that you could really imagine. What is pH? What does it mean? So technically, it is the hydrogen ion concentration in moles per liter, which is just a way to measure something. Just like you would say grams per liter, moles, chemistry, it's a big, big, big unit. But basically, it's the hydrogen ion concentration in a liquid. So in chemistry, the pH scale is used to specify the acid or base level of a solution. So if you look at this really cool pH scale on the left, you could actually see things that you would consider acidic, like battery acid. Doesn't sound fun. Lemon juice, things that you wouldn't want to eat, things that you don't want to put on your skin, vinegar, things like that are all super acidic, but that actually means that their pH level is super low. So if you are below a certain level, you're going to be acidic, but if you're above a certain level, you're going to be the opposite, which is basic. So 7 is the average. It's a scale from 1 to 14. And 7 is going to be the average. And when you think of that, you want to think of water. Water is like the most neutral solution. It is, all of our water should really be around 7 for pH, but that means that it's neither acidic nor basic. But if it's below 7, if it's 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, then it is going to be acidic. And the closer you get to the 1, the more acidic you are. And then the opposite is going to be basic. So the higher the number, the more basic you are. So that just means you either have more hydrogen ions when you're acidic or less hydrogen ions floating around when you are basic. So where is the hydrogen? Where is it all coming from? We've talked a lot about carbon dioxide. We've talked about pH, but if pH means that there's more hydrogen in solution, where's this hydrogen coming from? So our pH will actually change with our increasing carbon dioxide because there are chemical reactions occurring in the water which release a bunch of hydrogen. So if you see over here on the right, we have a really cool infographic where you see the carbon dioxide entering the water. It combines with the water, some chemical reactions happen, and then all of a sudden, a free hydrogen ion is let loose from that chemical reaction, and that makes it more acidic. That makes our pH go down, and it means that there are more hydrogen ions just floating around in the water, ready to do some bad things. As long as there's excess CO2 in the ocean, there'll be more free floating hydrogen ions. So hydrogen is really what we care about. When we're talking about pH, we are saying there's either more or less hydrogen ions, and that's going to mess some stuff up for us. I did put this in there. It is just the exact chemical equation. I'm not a chemist. I don't expect any of you to be chemists. It is just showing us exactly what happens when carbon and water combine. It creates our H2CO3, and that eventually turns into HCO3, and then that's where our floating hydrogen comes in. But I will break that down a little better in the next slide. Don't worry about it. Just in case you were curious, this is the actual chemical equation for what happens in the ocean when carbon dioxide gets introduced in high levels. So a constant chemical cycle is formed. First, the carbon dioxide reacts with the water to form carbonic acid. That's what we saw here. This right here is our carbonic acid. So as you're putting CO2 into water, those two things are going to have a chemical reaction combine and make that middle piece, the carbonic acid. Then these chemical reactions will release a floating hydrogen ion. Like I said, pH will decrease, something will become more acidic if there's more hydrogen ions present. So as we showed here, this substance will actually break down into HCO3 and then that free floating hydrogen ion, and that's what makes us more acidic. You might be wondering, why is hydrogen so bad? Like, why is that the thing that makes it more acidic? What actually happens when something is acidic? Now we know that it means there's more hydrogen ions present, but like, what does that do? Essentially, since that hydrogen is positive, everywhere I've been writing it, it's H+. That means that has like a positive charge. That means it's really attractive to other elements. As you see here, the carbonate, which we have a lot of in the ocean, especially for our calcium carbonate organisms, things that build shells. Carbonate is super attracted to hydrogen. It'll actually attach and create a new substance. So as there are more free floating hydrogen ions, any free carbonate ions will attach to it. And this results in less overall carbonate in the ocean. That is the one chemical reaction we're super concerned about. Because when something is more acidic, you're picturing it breaking down things, you're picturing it like boiling things away. When I picture something being acidic, I'm like, battery acid, that could like eat through a table if you just dump a bunch of battery acid on the table, right? But that is because it's breaking apart different things. It's breaking apart other elements, other combinations of chemicals, because that hydrogen is so attractive. Just like here, we have the carbonate floating around the water, and it should be going into our shells. It should be combining with calcium to create shells for our shelled organisms, for our coral, for our clams, oysters, things like that. But if there are a bunch of hydrogens floating around in that water, all the carbonate is actually going to attach the hydrogen, and there'll be nothing left for those organisms to use to build up those shells. Like I said, an acid is a chemical that gives off hydrogen ions in water, forms salt by combining with certain metals. Essentially, the presence of all of that carbon dioxide in our oceans, it's creating more free floating hydrogen ions, and that's what's making it more acidic. And those hydrogen ions are combining with all the carbonate that is super necessary for anything with a shell, for oysters, mussels, clams, our coral reefs. All of those things need carbonate to be able to grow a nice, strong, thick shell and protect itself. But since there's so much free floating hydrogen in the water, that's using up all of the carbonate, and there's nothing left for the shells. As you see here at the bottom, we actually have sort of a timeline that'll show you way back in the day, the average pH of the ocean used to be 8.2. Right now, it's about 8.1. So as I said, the pH is decreasing, but that does mean it's more acidic. And that blocks the growth of things that use up that carbonate. So it blocks the growth of anything with a shell, all of our corals, things like that. And in the future, if this trend continues on, soon we're not going to have anything that can build a shell. None of those organisms are going to be able to survive because they won't be able to build up those shells to protect themselves. There are some organisms that are like, yes, I love an acidic environment. This is where I thrive. But those are mostly going to be those jellyfish, which I don't know about you. I don't really want more of those unless we absolutely have to have them. I've been stung by a jellyfish a bunch of times. Not fun. And there's only certain organisms that actually eat them and benefit from them. So if we have nothing with a shell, no clams, oysters, mussels, things that people love to eat, by the way, I'd be so sad if we didn't have scallops anymore to eat. And we didn't have our coral reefs anymore, which we already know, super important ecosystem. All the ocean's going to have is a bunch of jellyfish. It's going to be real sad. So the importance of carbonate, we did just talk about this a little bit, but this sort of expands it. Carbonate is super important for the creation of calcium carbonate shells. So that is all of our coral, all of our shelled organisms, but also in this picture right here, that's actually a plankton. That is a tiny microscopic organism. So many different things in the ocean use calcium carbonate shells because you're just floating around out there. Things are trying to eat you. The most efficient way for you to protect yourself is to just build a wall around yourself and make sure you are safe from any predators. But if you can't build that wall, if that shell is broken down, you are not going to be safe. It is not good for you. They build shells really slowly when an environment is super acidic. One, because that carbonate is just not available. They can't get carbonate from an ocean where it's getting used up by all of those hydrogen. But if something is acidic enough, if you put something like a shell into straight acid, like vinegar or battery acid or something, it's going to actually start to dissolve. And that's what we're actually seeing in a lot of our ocean creatures in areas that the pH drops rapidly because of a bunch of different reasons. Little pockets can actually have lower pH than the whole ocean. But when that happens, it actually starts to visibly break down the shells. Things that have already built up a shell, you could put a mussel in there and you see the shell just start to deteriorate. Just like at the beginning, at the very first slide I showed with that GIF of those shells breaking down, that's essentially what's happening, just at a slow rate. So sometimes you don't see it happening with your eyes in real time, but it is happening and it's stressing out that organism. And if an organism's stressed, it doesn't have time to go collect food. It doesn't have time to reproduce. It doesn't have time to strengthen itself. All it's focusing its energy on right now is, oh my gosh, my shell is breaking down. I need to put all my energy into building up my shell. Another fun fact that I learned, well, not fun, another fact that I learned while putting together this presentation, because when you think about ocean acidification, you're always like, the organisms that build those shells, that is what is in trouble. That is the only thing in trouble. And they're super important. We know that our coral reefs are very important to our ecosystem. They are the biodiversity hotspot of the sea. They're the rainforest of the sea. So many different organisms live and survive in and because of those coral reefs. And then we like our clams, oysters, scallops, those sorts of things. But they're not really cute and cuddly. They're not really easy for us to go, oh, I feel bad that that mussel is being stressed out. But a lot of times people get that emotional connection to something more relatable, like our marine mammals, which I personally love. I work with marine mammals and they are so charismatic. But some of those scientists are actually saying that ocean acidification is going to affect our marine mammals and our megafauna, all those big things that we know and we care about immediately in a way that we could notice immediately. They are going to be affected because the increased acidity of the ocean will actually interfere with their communication. The more acidic a solution is, it actually is going to change the density of that water. So if the density of the ocean is changed, the sound traveling through it will also change. Sound can travel farther and be louder in a more acidic environment. And those marine mammals use sound to communicate. They use sound to find their food, like echolocation. They use sound to communicate with codas, like our sperm whales, from across an ocean basin. But if the ocean is more acidic and things travel faster and things are louder, it sounds like it could be good for our marine mammals because we're like, oh, they won't have to work as hard to make noise. But the ocean is already so loud because of our shipping industry. Boats that are traveling across the ocean, they make a lot of noise. When we are doing any sort of construction on our coasts, whenever we're dredging, whenever we're drilling into our oceans for oils or other minerals, that creates a ton of noise. And sound pollution, noise pollution is already something that we know is really, really bad for our marine mammals. It can drive them crazy because they can't just cover their ears. They can't put in earplugs. They just have to live with it. And if it's so loud that they can't communicate with their pod, with their family, with their other species, then lots of times things happen where either they get separated, they get hurt. Sometimes they even beach themselves if something is too loud. Lots of the beaching events can be attributed to some sort of loud event going on. They were doing seismic, they were doing blasting, they were trying different like naval navigation things, and there were beaching events nearby of whales, dolphins, things like that, because it's just so loud. They need to get out of the water because that's all they could really do to avoid that noise. So as the oceans get more acidic, we care about all of our calcareous organisms, all those things creating calcium carbonate shells, but it also is going to affect our marine mammals as well down the line. So essentially ocean acidification affects everything. If you see here, there are direct effects. So ocean acidification will hurt anything that has a shell, like these diatoms, anything that's like a coral reef or those mussels building their shell. They will also affect things like our jellyfish. They will actually let it, so there's less competition for the jellyfish, and the jellyfish are like, I could live in an acidic environment, but who really wants more jellyfish in their ocean? But it'll also have indirect effects. Like I said, for those marine mammals, one, it'll start decreasing their food source. So anything that those marine mammals eat, some of them do eat shellfish, but mostly a lot of them are going to be eating fish, krill, things like that. Even if what they're eating doesn't build a shell itself, a lot of those fish rely on coral reefs. They rely on things that build shells. So if all of a sudden their food source and their protection's gone, there's not going to be as many fish. If there's not as many fish, there's not enough food for those whales. So it's not just the direct effects of it being too loud, too much noise pollution. It's also the indirect effects of, well, if something happens to their food source, then something's going to happen to that food source, then something's going to happen to what I'm eating, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, everything is connected, and ocean acidification does really affect all levels of the ocean. So that was depressing. I know ocean acidification isn't necessarily a happy or exciting topic to talk about, but it's important to know about it so you could also know what to do to help. So what can we do? There is coral restoration and shellfish restoration, which I'll explain a little bit later. There's carbon sequestering in mangroves, estuaries, seagrass beds, ocean floor, and there's also just reducing our carbon emissions. So first, we're going to talk about our restoration options. It's basically human intervention. It is a human-caused problem because of us burning all those different fossil fuels and releasing so much CO2. Ocean acidification is kind of our fault. So we are trying to take the step up and fix it. Human intervention to cause shellfish and coral restoration. Essentially, it is breeding shellfish or coral in a lab. Sometimes you'll take a little piece of coral off in the wild, bring it back to your lab, grow it there. Sometimes you'll create these really cool coral farms in areas that you know are protected, which is what they're doing here. They're tending some coral farms. Or those shellfish, they start them growing in a lab, and then once they've reached a certain size where they're pretty good to survive on their own, they will go put them out to the ocean. And it's fixing the problem as it happens, but that's not necessarily the best. Like, it's great that we are doing something. Coral restoration and shellfish restoration are super important, but it is reactive instead of proactive. So we're just trying to slap a Band-Aid on the problem, trying to fix the things that we see. So we're saying ocean acidification has caused less coral and less shellfish, so we're just going to put more coral and shellfish out into the ocean. But if the ocean is still getting more and more acidic, a lot of those aren't going to survive anyway. So it's a great way for us to help in the short term, but in the long term, it's very important to take some greater steps than that. Carbon sequestering is super important, and it's something that our oceans already do. I just want to touch on it, that it is something that is related to not just our oceans, but a lot of different environments that we could also help conserve, and then that will directly affect our ocean acidification. So the ocean's predisposed to store and sequester certain parts of carbon, and this really happens in the ocean, on the ocean floor. So it'll store carbon in a way that like it's not going to be introduced back into the system immediately. It's going to take thousands on thousands on thousands of years for it to be released again. And that's usually at a specific depth, where after the carbon reaches a certain depth, it just can't really dissolve anymore. It can't be circled back up into the system. So it's very good when it reaches that depth. Or once it hits the ocean floor and then sediment lands on top of it, and it's just basically buried in sediment, and then it's just a pocket under all the sediment living in the bottom of the ocean, and we don't even have to think about it. So the ocean does both of those things to sort of store that dissolved carbon, and also those carbonate organisms. So like I said, those phytoplankton, those diatoms, little tiny microscopic things that create those calcium carbonate shells, those will also die and leave their shell, and that falls to the ocean floor and sort of stores a little bit of the carbon, buries it as well. But the important ecosystems that are really good at storing carbon, that if we were to protect them, it would be a huge step for reducing carbon in our ecosystem, is going to be mangroves, estuaries and marshlands, seagrass beds, and algae. So those are all a lot of the plants that use that CO2, that use that carbon dioxide in their energy production with that photosynthesis, and then they store it in their bodies, in their plant limbs, for the duration of their life. Estuaries and marshlands, I didn't actually know about until recently. Those are like the mucky, marshy lands, and carbon does get stored in soil, like even just the dirt outside your house, like carbon can be stored there a little bit, but those marshlands are so efficient at storing carbon. They will just mix in carbon with all that muck and goo and grossness and just push it down back into the earth, and we don't have to worry about it. So protecting all these different ecosystems is actually a great way for us to help the world basically hide their own carbon and store their own carbon for long periods of time. And then finally, reducing carbon emissions. So you can reduce your personal carbon footprint. I love all of the different things that I've been seeing on social media and in the news about things like the plastic straw movement, where everyone just decided, okay, you know what? We don't need straws. We could use metal straws. We could use reusable straws. We're just not going to use them anymore. And so many different businesses and so many different places have actually switched to paper straws and other things, or just not giving straws. You have to ask for it. And that is huge. That is great because you are cutting back on your personal resource use and waste production. So here is your carbon footprint down here. It's made up of travel, gas, energy, waste. If you recycle, those are all great things. And that's all very important because, like the straw movement showed, a few people were like, we don't need this, and here's why. And then the entire world was like, you know what? We don't need this. Let's just stop. And that's huge. That's amazing. But about 70% of the world's carbon emission come from just 100 major companies. So cutting back on my personal carbon footprint is good for me, and I'm being kind to the world. But big picture wise, it's very important to think about who's producing the most waste, who's actually releasing the most carbon. Because my personal use is such a microscopic level when it comes to major corporations, major companies that are actually releasing tons and tons of waste and carbon. Over here, I actually have a little infographic with the top 20 producers. These 20 companies produce 35% of the entire world's carbon emissions, which is huge, huge, huge. As you can see, a large majority of them are going to be our fossil fuel companies. But for the 70% of our carbon emissions produced by only 100 companies all over the world, that's going to be so many different groups, not just fossil fuel. So it's important to research into that, figure out who is producing that sort of waste, and decide if you want to support them or not. But real change can best be affected by addressing major producers with things like petitions, legislation, activism. And that sounds like this huge, scary thing, but there are actually tons of groups, tons of small groups that you could help out that are doing these sorts of things. So I just listed a few that I'm familiar with. We've worked with Oceana a couple times. These are groups that are going out and creating petitions and legislation and things that you could sign and people that you could call that are actually going to make rules about who can release how much carbon, what we could use. And these are the sort of things that'll really affect those 100 companies that are producing 70% of our carbon emissions. They're really, really cool groups. I'm sure there are hundreds and hundreds more, but it's very good and important for you to reduce your own carbon footprint, just because the easiest way is to lead by example. But if you wanted to be part of the greater change, be part of affecting that 70% of carbon emissions, these sorts of groups are very good about trying to push forward on the legislative end. I think that is about it for me. Does anyone have any questions? I threw a ton of information at you all at once. I think I broke down the actual chemistry behind it to bite-sized pieces, but if any of that didn't make sense, please make sure to throw it in the chat. If you wanted more information about any of those particular groups, I think Oceana is the one that we've worked pretty closely with, but some of these are Florida-based, some of them are just world-based, but a lot of them have volunteer programs that you could even be working on from home, virtual volunteering, just about writing petitions and creating infographics and educating people, because knowledge is power, and the more people that know about this sort of thing, the more likely change will actually happen. I think that is it. I'm going to stop sharing. Ooh. I don't know if that just froze my computer. Okay. Well, if you all can still hear me, I am here. I'm going to be keeping an eye on that chat, so I'll keep it open for a minute. There we go. I don't know if Zoom is freaking out right now. There we go. Okay, I think everything unfroze. Let me bring this box over here and check the chat real quick. If no one has any questions, or if you think of questions later on in life, you are always welcome to email us at meec@nova.edu, or to just direct message us on any of our social media at Seek the MEEC. Those are all great ways to reach out to us. And if I don't know the answer, I'm sure that our other educator might, and we will get the answers for your questions. I don't think I see anything in the chat. Otherwise, we are doing this webinar every Saturday. Our March schedule is complete. So next Saturday, we actually have our very own MEEC intern, Taylor Burke. She is a huge advocate about the major problems we have in our, sorry, Zoom keeps freaking out on me. She's a huge advocate about the algae blooms and the red tides that we see all the time here in South Florida. So she is going to be doing a brief presentation on that. So make sure that you join us. It is the same link that we use today, but make sure you join us next Saturday at 1 p.m. to check that out. Otherwise, thank you all for coming and hanging out with me today. This is recorded, so if you missed any of it, or if I glitched out for any of it, I'll be editing it and putting it onto our YouTube channel at Seek the MEEC, and you can check it out there, share it with whomever you want. Thank you all for joining us today, and hopefully we will see you next week. Bye, guys. I'm going to try to close this. Zoom is freaking out, so we'll see.